What are some less known, darker facts about beloved countries? Story 1. If you've ever looked at a country like Liechtenstein on a map and wondered how a country that small can maintain a flourishing economy, the answer is that they're one of the largest offshore banking sites in the world. Most people only think of the Cayman Islands when it comes to offshore banking, but the Cayman Islands aren't even close to being the only place where rich people stash their money to avoid paying taxes on it. Most of the places that do it are territories and not countries. The Cook Islands, Anguilla, Jersey, and Guernsey are a few other big offshore banking sites. But Liechtenstein has made it the core of their economy. Story 2. During the World War II, the Swiss National Bank accepted large quantities of gold from the German Reichsbank as payment for Swiss export shipments, weapons, ammunition. A large part of this Reichsbank gold had either been looted by the German occupying forces from the stocks of the occupied countries Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. Story 3. In around 1910, the Australian government decided it was a good idea to steal indigenous children from their mothers and send them to schools to be taught. Some of them never even saw their parents again. They were called the stolen generation. They also did this with white single mothers, the white stolen generation. If mothers gave birth but were not married, hospitals would collude to take the child and give it to the willing nuns, who were primed and ready to take the orphan into their system. A lot of those kids ended up being victimized in Catholic crimes. It absolutely was official government policy, as it was part of the immigration effort to stock Australia with white people. White children were taken from their families in other nations under the guise of having a free vacation in Australia, only to have their entire pasts erased, names changed, and all ties with their families cut, so that they could be orphaned and then adopted into white Australian families in order to increase the white population. Story 4. Sarawak ignores the natives called the Pennin. They still live in the jungle and are basically a jungle nomad. But due to the timber industry making big bucks, the government and logging companies ignore them and destroy close to or more than 50% of the rainforest. If you find information from the government, they will say it is not true and whatnot. Bruno Mansour was an activist who fought for their rights and the perseverance of the rainforest, but he mysteriously disappeared. I think it was in the 90s, can't remember. Until today, no one knows what happened to him. Conspiracy theories range from him hiding or lost in the jungle to the government assassinating him. Story 5. South Korea has some fun stuff going around. Spy cam, or hidden camera epidemic. Government encourages women to marry and give birth, but won't do anything to change harsh working hours, conditions, and requirements. Plus, little benefit to actually raise families. Pregnancy out of wedlock is considered shameful. Celebrities can be shut down if they speak out to extremities or get on someone's bad side. Ailey comes to mind here. Netizens are oft harsh in judgment of others, especially celebrities and politicians. Tableau of Epic High comes to mind. The Korean War and its consequences are darker than what your average history books will tell you. Even the nicer South Koreans have a darker side regarding destroying of villages suspected of being northern spies or activists. And the like presidents in Korea hardly ever go scandal free. It's still quite patriarchal here. Natives still want sons. Military service is of great honor. Despite being enforced by law, lots of overall power trips authorities, particularly the police, can't handle a domestic violence dispute. A drunk man with an episode is judged as being under the influence and gets a slap on the wrist. A domestic case can be dismissed if one side, either the aggressor or the intimidated victim, tells authorities that it's not a big deal. In fact, laws and judgment in general are weak here. Story 6. Not sure if beloved as much as pitied, but I'll chime in about Haiti. They won their independence from French colonists in 1804, which was incredible and proud. But after the war, Dessalines committed a genocide against white residents. Upon his death, there were tensions between the blacks and the mulatto class, and the country was divided between Henri Christophe in the north, with the support of most blacks, and Alexandre Pétion in the south, with the mulettes and gens de couleur, men of color, equal sign people who were freedmen pre-revolution. Christophe established an autocratic kingdom and an unpaid feudal plantation system, near to slavery, albeit with less cruelty, to try and export sugar for profit, while Pétion went from democratic rule to eventually abolishing the legislature. The country would be reunited in 1820 by Boyer, only for him to conquer the future Dominican Republic, which Haiti would hold until 1844. Fun facts to balance that out. Haiti was the first country to recognize Greek independence against the Ottomans. Haiti gave Simon Bolivar sanctuary, after which he was able to rebel against Spain to create Gran Colombia. Story 7. Scrolled for a bit. Haven't seen South Korea mentioned. This country was a US sanctioned military dictatorship until relatively recently. Government corruption is still a huge problem, to the point that several presidents have been thrown in jail. Most recently in 2017. Their current prosperous but stagnating economy was built on decades of worker suppression and anti union political and cultural attitudes that allowed large corporations like Samsung and Hyundai to exploit people and throw them to the wayside. The majority of people living beneath the poverty line are elderly. Most have no pension from their job and barely get a pittance from the government. Attitudes about work and the culture here lead people to suffer from severe stress, which they typically cope with by becoming alcoholics. The leading cause of death among children is suicide, as many are expected to work well over 10 hours a day at extracurricular academies and cram schools and do not have any free time. K-pop idols are recruited from about 13 years old to basically go to singer boot camp and receive no other education. Their production companies strictly control their lives, all the way down to their diet, and most have no career options when they're no longer young and attractive enough to draw people's attention. Some of these companies also withhold large portions of performers' earnings and do not hand them over once the contracts are completed. Aside from that, it's a great country that everybody should visit. Story 8. The Vipholm experiments were a series of human experiments where patients of Vipholm Hospital for the intellectually disabled in Lund, Sweden, were fed large amounts of sweets to provoke dental caries. 1945, 1955. The experiments were sponsored both by the sugar industry and the dentist community in an effort to determine whether carbohydrates affected the formation of cavities. They had people with mental disabilities eat very sugary candy to see its effects on their dental health. They got very sticky toffee, which encouraged them to really get it all around their teeth, and they for sure weren't allowed to brush their teeth. Just horrible. Story 9. Germany's efficiency is blocked by ignoring digitalization for many years. Our political system is corrupt as hell, and even though we have a social system with healthcare, the gap between rich and poor is getting bigger and bigger. It gets messed up more and more every year. But for some reason, all people that I meet when traveling think that we Germans living in a country full of efficient and happy workers. Story 10. The United States has forced economic chokeholds and coups on dozens of other countries, as well as then carried on to install one of our yes men as dictator of some said countries, who then sell us copper, oil, or whatever resource for cheap. And it forces the populations of those countries into a perpetual state of wage slavery. Yeah, in the 20th and 21st centuries, just plain old colonialism is now frowned upon. So neocolonialism, where instead of Guatemala becoming the 51st state, they stay Guatemala, but are also reduced to basically a banana factory that we make money off of. Story 11. South Africa. The famous Truth and Reconciliation Commission helped prevent a civil war by granting amnesty to people who committed serious crimes during apartheid. Basically, the deal was that you would get amnesty if you made a full and open public confession. People who refused to testify would be prosecuted for their crimes. However, the prosecutions of people who did not take part in the TRC never happened, and over 20 years later, the ANC-led government still refuses to take the TRC seriously or to prosecute them. We still have senior people in our prosecution police force who had credible accusations of serious crimes made against them during the TRC process, but were never prosecuted. These are people who routinely tortured and killed black people at the behest of the apartheid government, including the killing of senior ANC officials. Story 12. Well, my homeland, Slovenia, is beloved by me. And while it is true that we don't have a history of genocides, concentration camps, or oppressing minorities, you can still find some shady stuff. The worst of all in recent history is, in my opinion, the izbris, or deletion in English. Basically, during the early 90s, when the state was securing its independence, state officials erased tens of thousands of people who lived in Slovenia from official registers. The justification? These people were Yugoslav citizens with no Slovene Republic citizenship, and if they wanted to become citizens of the independent Slovenia, they should have applied until certain deadline, since they didn't too bad for them. However, the truth was that a lot of these people were not Slovenes, but members of other Yugoslav ethnic groups, and were perceived by some as a potential fifth column in the struggle for independence. So the officials erased them. These people were therefore not citizens of any country, not of Slovenia and not of Yugoslavia since it fell apart. This meant a civilian death. You want to buy a house? Show a document. Want to travel abroad? You don't have a passport. Want to work? Cannot get a contract since you have no documents. Want to open a bank account? Without documents, it is impossible, etc. This was only solved after my country was sentenced by the ECHR to pay damages to affected people and was forced to remedy the situation. But this only happened more than 20 years after the people became apatridas. Their lives were essentially destroyed. Oh, and some of our current politicians, among them our PM, are proud of what happened and even defend this sad event. Story 13. Ireland's mother and baby homes. Some of these were opened up to the early 90s US. They used to house single mothers who were placed there by their families, as being a single mother was considered a sin by the Catholic Church. There was a lot of abuse in these homes, and in many cases, the mothers had their babies removed from them and illegally adopted, all run by religious orders, with the governments knowing. I'm not sure exactly what the governments know. What was going on there? If you Google Ireland's mother and baby homes or Magdalene laundries, you can get more information. Story 14. Canadian residential schools. I grew up in one of the first generations to be taught about it in school, but it was pretty horrible. The Canadian government set up over 100 schools across the country, ran by religious leaders, where Indigenous children would be separated from their families, forced to speak exclusively English French, were denied their native tongue and cultural practices, were given European names, and suffered all kinds of abuse while living there. The first school opened in 1831, and the last one closed its doors in 1996. In case you thought this was a recent event, I'd suggest reading up on the Indian Act of Canada, 1876. It really shows you the extent to which the government tried to assimilate the native people of the country. Story 15. I'm sure it's been mentioned, but the horrors and abuses of residential school victims, the dismissal of murdered and missing Indigenous women, the false promises our government feeds the Indigenous community, and the lies it feeds its national people, and of course, gentrification, drugs, and gangs. Also, silence on police abuses toward Indigenous and Black communities. Canada isn't a country of miracles. We just pride ourselves in being slightly better than America. I was once proud to be a Canadian, but we have become so watered down that my pride has turned to shame. Story 16. Japan's army and navy during World War II absolutely hated each other. This stemmed from a disagreement on how to expand the empire. The army wanted to push through China and fight the Russians, while the navy wanted to go south and take the islands below. This is what they did. As for the dark part, these disagreements became so bad that the two sides began assassinating each other's ministers or representatives. This went further and further until finally the Navy had enough and went to their ships in the harbor and began loading shells, completely ready to fire into their own homeland, presumably the army. They only stopped because the emperor himself stepped in and told them to cut it out. As for more facts, the Navy refused to evacuate army troops from some of those islands during America's island hopping campaign. They only did it because, again, the emperor had to tell them to do it. It was a real mess. The Navy would frequently dump barrels of supplies offshore at army bases on the islands, making the army men swim to retrieve them. Effectively, drive-by supplies, where rarely all the supplies were taken. Story 17. In northern Canada, there is what's known as a blue run, where police will pick up a drunk native outside of the res and bring them to the middle of nowhere and leave them. In the dead of winter at night, they freeze to death within an hour or so. Strangest thing is they're usually found unclothed and have buried themselves in the snow. Something about being that cold and drunk makes your body think it's actually hot and you need to strip down. Snow is a great insulator, but you need to keep warm for that to be useful. They're usually found by a single set of footprints going off the road and none coming back. Canada is secretly super racist to natives. Story 18. I'll chime in. The Indian education system is still highly reminiscent of the system that the British introduced to manufacture factory workers devoid of any will or creativity. No one in the political spectrum tries to change it, because at the end, it is advantageous to them. The Indian Board of Censorship controls all media and news, to the point that from birth to adulthood, a sense of nationalism is instilled among its citizens that doesn't make them question the behavior of any political representative, and sometimes even support the individual without any gain. This system of education and media creates a cycle that would dictate their entire lives from birth to death, that would only see benefit to the society rather than the individual. This is also a major factor behind the ever-increasing number of Indian immigrants. That's why whenever you see an Indian person on any social media, don't hate on them. Hate the system, not the people. Story 19. The United States essentially created the version we know of the Taliban. The Taliban were fighting the Afghan war and attempting to stop the Soviet Union from coming down on the country from the north. The US provided weapons to the Taliban and promised them they would help reconstruct Afghanistan and the war torn areas in exchange for repealing the Soviet Union, as they were the US' biggest enemy at the time. A young Osama bin Laden led the Taliban forces and won. When it was time to pay back the debt of gratitude, the US was essentially like, thanks and peace out. Oh, but can you return our weapons, please? To which obviously the Taliban said no. The US were then forced to buy back their weapons. They were not able to recuperate them all, which the Taliban used to buy even more. The main anger of the Taliban towards the US was the failure to provide stability and recovery to the people whom they used to target an enemy the US did not want to fight themselves. A lot of this can be found in the book Facing the Taliban, a very interesting read. Story 20, The Last Human Zoo in Europe, Belgium specifically, I believe, was closed in 1940, and attempts to reopen them lasted well into the 1950s. All major cities in Belgium have highly prominent statues and buildings named after some of the objectively worst, most murderous people in history, which remains fully and completely ignored since it happened on African soil to Africans. Our beloved, oh so liberal Dutch still have a tradition pre-Christmas where people in a full blackface jump off of literal ships, scream like monkeys, and act stupid to tickle kids and give them candy. Beside the dark paint on their skin, they also draw on large red lips, wear afro wigs, and wear gold earrings. But of course, the skin is not meant to look like African black skin, but just got dirty from chimneys, of course. Basically, most European countries have done nothing at all to own up to their colonial history and atrocities, and the main reason Germany had to own up to the Holocaust is because they messed with other European countries. Most other European countries were perfectly happy to hand over their undesirables. After all, Germans should have just kept their paws off their land. Edit. Oh, let me not forget, Germany kept the skulls of murdered Hereros and Nama, Namibian tribes targeted by genocide, in some lab from 1905 until 2018 in a failed effort to prove the genetic superiority of whites. We are also still considering apologizing for the death of 100,000 that wiped out up to 75% of those tribes. Not sure yet if we're actually sorry, apparently. Story 21. This is seen as very dark by the Pakeha people I know, but I don't see it that way. This is very common in New Zealand, but most Kiwis don't even know about it. Maori people will steal other Maori people's dead bodies. First, let me explain the typical Maori death process. But keep in mind that lots of Maori funerals are different. When a Maori person dies, they are returned to their home as soon as possible. For some people, they return to the house they lived in, and for others, it's their marae. Fun fact, dead people are never to be walked through the door in a marae. They must go through the window. Maori are never left alone after their death, so people usually set up beds or couches and sleep next to their deceased loved one. People will come and wail over their loved ones. After this, their funeral takes place. Maori believe that you should return to the earth the way you entered it, with your full body. We even bury placentas on our homeland. You can be cremated, but it is preferred that you are buried in your family cemetery as your whole self. Maori have their own religion, so this is a religious, cultural, and spiritual way to treat the dead. If you are a Maori person, you are expected to return to your IWE. This doesn't apply for all Maori, but if you don't do this, they might go and steal the dead person. It doesn't really matter where. They will steal them from your house. They will steal them from a cemetery. They will steal their ashes, whatever it takes. The police can't do anything. You have to go to court to be able to get your loved one back. It's not malicious in any way. They just want their wano to be with their ancestors, and my family is okay with that. This rule especially counts for well-known Maori families, which is where my family fits in. My papa, aunts, uncles, and my dad will all be expected to return to their homeland. Story 22. I live in a relatively small city in the Italian Alps, and lately I've been chatting with this Malay girl, and we've become pretty good friends. So I sent her a video of how my neighborhood looks, and she texted me back with something along the lines of, "Bro, the Paris syndrome is hitting so hard, and we ain't even in Paris. Where are the churches and the unclothed statues?" Thing is that my neighborhood is made up of this odd mix of brutalist architecture and fascist public housing. But the stylistic clash ain't even the worst part. Everything looks dead, dirty, decrepit. From the old, now squatted bocciofila to the newer concrete high-rise blocks, everything somehow manages to be covered in this layer of powder and boredom. And she got exposed to all of this after me talking about the mountains, the history of my city, and most importantly, after crapping over all those suburban rappers that come here to shoot their videos while trying their best to make things look overly grimy. I am so tired of these kids that act tough just because they are from here that I ended up playing down or ignoring that they get glorified by some. Story 23. From 1901 to 1966, Australia engaged in what was informally known as the White Australia Policy. This was initially aimed to keep Asians and Africans out, but quickly expanded to, we don't like the sound of that Italian accent either. Immigration officials would set tests for potential immigrants in foreign languages. The catch was, it wasn't the potential immigrants' language. It was just a random language the official decided they probably wouldn't know. Throughout the civil rights movement in the rest of the West, our politicians sat back smiling from ear to ear while making statements like, we intend to keep this country white and not allow its people to be faced with the problems that at present are practically insoluble in many parts of the world. Stanley Bruce, during the 1925 federal election, he won. Story 24. I'm not sure the UK/Britain/England would count as a beloved country anymore, but if there's a standout horror among our extremely dark history, it's the late Victorian Holocaust. Between 1876 and 1902, the world faced a number of pressures on its food production caused by the El Niño Southern Oscillation, ENSO. The laissez-faire economic dogma at the time, being as it was in the middle of the golden age of capitalism, resulted in European populations being only mildly affected. India, however, having this economic dogma imposed on it and enforced largely by Britain, suffered 3 large-scale famines and several smaller ones, resulting in up to 60 million deaths. This is a gross oversimplification, and one that's challenged by certain empire apologists, absolutely not representing the consensus among historians on how involved and accountable Britain was for the market economics of the time. But for my part, I consider it the darkest thing among our already extremely dark history, and it's rarely acknowledged.